Paul John Knowles has been described as more brutal than Ted Bundy. Today's video is on a solved true crime about the Casanova Killer. Now, before we do get into today's video, just a quick disclaimer. This video is for educational purposes. I mean absolutely no harm. My findings are based on research which I have compiled together. This does contain child abuse, sexual assault, necrophilia. So if this is something you do not want to hear, please do click off this video. I'm sure I will see you with another case. So with that being said, let's get straight into today's video, shall we? So Paul Knowles was born on April 25th, 1946 in Orlando, Florida. Paul was known to have had a very difficult childhood. I believe he was raised by his father. Unfortunately, I couldn't find any information on his mother. So in the house was Paul and a few of his brothers, being raised by his father. However, his father was very neglectful, physically abusive, and often threatened his sons to remain silent with the abuse they were receiving. He often said to them, if they were to speak on the abuse they were receiving, they would get taken away and they would have had a much worse life. The sons all grew up being violent, lawbreakers, and just badly behaved in general as young as 8 years old, mainly because their father did not teach them right from wrong. They, to a certain extent, had no consciousness. His father did not care about those kids. So how was Paul at school? He never did his homework, talked back at teachers, was very violent in the playground. And as he and his brothers grew older, they started getting into trouble with the police, and this indeed annoyed their father. And one day, he decided he no longer wanted his kids and sent them into foster care. This should show you how much they meant to him. In the foster care system, Paul was being bounced around from one foster home to another. Whilst this was going on, his crimes were also increasing in severity. And Paul was eventually put into a youth detention center called Reformatory at the time. The particular one he went to was called Dozier School for Boys, or Florida School for Boys, and it was one of the most notoriously horrific places on earth and had many allegations against them, including torturing kids and even murder, with blood stains all across their walls in which no staff member could be bothered to clean them. From what I could gather, there were about 80 boys who died at the Florida School for Boys, and that was just the records. So imagine how many more they managed to hide. It's crazy to me how the school managed to run on for so long despite these allegations. The school was actually shut down in 2011. Could you imagine? They found the remains of approximately 50 boys on site. So you could only imagine the environment that Paul Knowles was brought up in. When Paul was 19 years old, he committed his first kidnapping, in which started with him stealing a car. Now it seems he didn't plan to go out there and kidnap. He was mainly focused on stealing things and reselling them. So when he stole this car, the police caught on very quickly and were on his tail. He eventually got pulled over by a law officer who got out of his car and walked towards Knowles to have a quick chat. And when he did, Knowles ambushed the officer, stole his gun, and threatened the officer to get into the back of his car, where he held the officer hostage for some time. Now, I don't think he intended to kidnap someone that day. He just did it in the spur of the moment because he knew that he was going to get into trouble for stealing this car. So after like 2 hours of driving the officer around, he decided to just drop him off on a side road unharmed. Knowles did end up being arrested and charged for this kidnapping and was sent to Rainfalls prison for about 10 years. 1974 was the last year of his sentence, and by that point he was 28 years old. And in the last year of his jail sentence in 1974, Paul Knowles actually managed to meet a woman outside named Angela Kovic, and the two of them started writing to each other. Did you know they actually met through a magazine named American Astrology, in which I believe Angela's mother owned? Paul Knowles was very much into astrology, so he would check his horoscope every single day. And then one issue of this magazine, I think there was an article about the owner's daughter, in which was Angela. And Paul was reading this article. He liked the sound of this woman, so he decided to write to her. And when she received the letter, she thought this man was so charming and she really liked his handwriting. It was one of the things that attracted her to him. So she decided to write back to Paul, knowing fully well that he was in prison. So before long, the two formed a bit of a relationship. It was like a romantic relationship. She was recently divorced at the time and was actually on the look to meet someone new, and this charming stranger popped up. It didn't take long for her to visit him in prison, and when she did, it was in a supervised prison visit room where Paul Knowles got down on one knee and proposed to this woman, and she said yes. So now the two were engaged in jail, and I think the reason Paul Knowles was so quick to propose to this woman was because Angela had money, or at least her family had some sort of money, especially the mother. And in fact, the parents owned a nightclub in San Francisco as well, so there was a lot of money coming through into the family, lots of good connections, and Paul saw this as an opportunity. Because these two were now engaged, Angela started calling around every high esteemed lawyer that she knew to get one of them on his case in order to get him out of jail early. And one could say this is what he wanted this whole time. So Angela managed to get hold of a very great lawyer who started working on the case, and by May of 1974, literally within months of meeting Angela, he was released from prison. His plan worked, I guess, and then he moved to California to be with his new fiancée. But the engagement ended almost as quickly as it began. The kicker came one day when Angela went to go and see a psychic because she was into all those kind of things, and her psychic told her that she has got a very dangerous man in her life and she should be careful. Of course, Angela knew exactly what this psychic meant. So this freaked Angela out completely, and she decided to call off the wedding, and now the two were going their separate ways. So by now, Paul Knowles was single again at the age of 28. He has just been kicked out of the house that he shared with his fiancée in California and forced to start a life of his own back in Florida. And before long, Paul Knowles was right back to his criminal activities. If anything, it's gotten worse. Now, within a few weeks of arriving in Jacksonville, he was arrested for stabbing a bartender. He was taken to the police station and locked up in a holding cell where he actually managed to pick the lock and escape. Now you would think a holding cell is supposed to hold somebody in there, but nay, John Paul Knowles was indeed far ahead of these people. So this was on July 26, 1974. So he's picked the lock and now he is out again. And now he's realizing he doesn't have any money, and starts thinking about how he is going to survive, how he's going to pay for food and transport and things like that. So he recognized that he needed money, and he was going to get this through crime, obviously. So he decided that he was going to approach one of the first few houses that he saw, and he committed a home invasion. And the house he chose to break into belonged to a 65-year-old retired school teacher named Alice Curtis. Knowles broke into the house and ambushed Alice, tied her up, gagged her so that she couldn't disturb him, whilst he proceeded to ransack her entire house while stealing all valuable items. Once he was done, he quickly grabbed her keys, jumped into her car and stole it, and he just drove. Little did he know that that woman he had just left in the house, ambushed and gagged, was unintentionally his first murder victim. He had thought he left her alive. The following morning, Alice Curtis was found dead in her home, still tied up. It seems that when Knowles had gagged her, he'd knocked her dentures out of place, and she ended up choking to death on her own dentures. But Knowles had no idea that he had killed this woman, and Knowles just drove and drove and drove. I believe his plan was to drive out to an isolated area and ditch the car. However, on his way there, he saw two girls on the side of the road that he knew. They were sisters, 11-year-old Lillian and 7-year-old Milet Anderson. So the girls knew Paul, and when he was driving past, he made eye contact with them on the side of the road. Now, of course, he panicked because he just thought he has just been spotted in a stolen car, and these girls were going to snitch on him. So his next steps were to kidnap these girls off the side of the road, and he just continued driving. Now he has just made the situation much worse, because now if these girls were to get out of the car, of course they were going to tell their parents what had just happened. So he knew he couldn't possibly let them get away alive. So Paul drove these two girls to an isolated area, got them out of the car and strangled them to death, one after the other. And then he buried the bodies of these children in a nearby swamp. And neither of these children's remains have been found. So it is believed that we cannot confirm if he actually committed these crimes or not, because it was reported that before this incident the girls were already reported missing, and therefore the timing here does not correlate. What do you guys think? About a week later, on the 1st of August, another young girl in the area disappeared. This time it was 13-year-old Ima Jean Saunders, and everyone thought she had just run away from home. Little did they know that she had crossed paths with Paul Knowles. Not much is known about this one, however, it is believed that he murdered her in the same way he murdered the other two girls, strangled her and then hid her body somewhere. Years later, her skeleton remains were found in a wooded area, confirming that she had met a very tragic end. However, we cannot confirm that she was murdered, although it seemed that way. That is all we know about Irma, unfortunately. So the next very day, Knowles was back out again, and he was walking the streets of Atlantic Beach when he struck a conversation with 48-year-old woman named Marjorie Howie, and the two of them flirted and got on really well. Now Marjorie was very attracted to Knowles and invited him back to her place. This encounter ended with Paul strangling Marjorie with her own stockings, and when he was fleeing the scene, he actually took some things with him, for example, TV and gun. After this murder, he actually had a bit of a break for about 3 weeks or so. Now let's bear in mind that these murders he had committed so far were in a very short period of time. Paul returned back to his criminal activities on the 21st of August 1974. That night, he traveled from Florida to Georgia, and he broke into the home of a single woman named Kathy Sue Pierce, and her young son was home with her at the time. The next day, Kathy was found dead in her home. She was strangled to death. However, her 3-year-old son was found in his bedroom completely unharmed. Now, one must say this is very strange. However, people have suggested that in that situation, Paul saw himself in this 3-year-old boy and decided to have mercy on him. But we do not actually know why Paul decided to leave this 3-year-old boy alive, but I must say I am glad that he did. Next up for Paul, he drove to Ohio, where he actually lived for the next couple of weeks. He was living in a motel, walking the streets like a normal person, going shopping, going to bars. And it was at one of these bars where he met his next victim, an account executive, William Bates, and this was on the 3rd of September. William never returned home that night, and few days later his wife reported him missing. So the police began an investigation where they went to the pub in which Williams was last seen, and his car was no longer there. So now the belief theory was that he has just run off and didn't want to live this life anymore, so he just went off for a fresh start. Over the next 2 months, the police did try their best to find William, and it was until October of that year that they found his remains dumped in a wooded area, bound and gagged with electrical tape, and was also strangled to death. Now the police had no clue of who had done this. Now William's car wasn't there either, which led to the police thinking that the killer had taken it. Of course, this was right. Within few weeks, Paul Knowles was back on the run in his getaway car, and he was driving into any state of his choice, and he decided to make a stop in Nevada, in a place that had a little camping area where people could set up tents and stay. Upon his arrival, there was only one tent in the camping area, so Knowles walked over to the tent, and in there were some elderly couple, Emmett and Louise Johnson, and of course he seized the opportunity. Up until now, he had only been murdering people through strangulation, but now he decided to switch it up and get a gun and shot both of them at the back of their head. The couple were found in the morning still tied up, and their things were stolen, such as cash and credit cards. Meanwhile, Knowles had gotten away, and this time he was in Texas. It was September 21st when he saw his next victim standing on the highway, 40-year-old Charlene Heights, who was a motorcyclist, and her bike had actually broken down that day. So she was just simply trying to flag someone down on the side of the road for some help or for some lift, and unfortunately Paul Knowles was the only person to stop. Charlene Hicks was never seen alive again. It's believed that Paul Knowles abducted her, raped her, murdered her, and then ditched her body somewhere. And this time he had gone back to his old style, strangulation. A week later, on September 29, Knowles had traveled to Birmingham, Alabama, where he met a beautician named Ann Dawson. The details for this one is also quite vague, as there is little information that I could find. But the two spent the next few years together, where she was actually paying for absolutely everything. Now, a few people do believe that she was paying for absolutely everything because Paul had abducted her and was forcing her to use her credit card. Now, a few people do believe that Anne did use her free will to pay for those things because Paul Knowles was simply charming. What do you guys think about this one? So the two spent the next 6 days traveling around. But then on the 6th day, we believe something happened between the two. Unfortunately, we do not know what triggered it. But Paul decided to murder her and threw her body in the Mississippi River, where it's actually never been recovered. Knowles spent the next 2 weeks just driving around, and he ended up in Connecticut, where he decided to commit another home invasion. In one of the few houses that he came across, he decided to break into, and this one belonged to a single mother named Karen Wine and her 16-year-old daughter named Dawn. At the time, it was only Dawn who was home, and he raped her and strangled her to death. It wasn't long until the mother Karen had arrived home whilst Knowles was still at the house, and he decided to do the exact same thing to her. It is believed that he strangled both of them with their own nylon stockings, and he continued to ransack the house. And after that, he fled the scene, and 2 days later, he found himself in Virginia. Here, he needed to commit another home invasion because he was running out of money, and he came across the home of 52-year-old Doris Hovey. She was home alone at the time when Knowles forcefully broke in, where he told her to get her husband's rifle, and then, can you believe, he placed the rifle in her hand, making it look like it was a suicide. For the next few days, Knowles drove around, and he ended up in Florida. And he ended up seeing 2 hitchhikers on the side of the highway, and so he pulled over these 2 and got them in the back of his car. He most likely thought of killing them, however, things didn't get this far, because whilst he was driving, he got pulled over by the police for traffic violation, in which the officer let him off with a warning. So with this incident happening, Knowles started driving off, and he was very scared, knowing fully well that he was driving a stolen vehicle from one of his murder victims. He was so scared that he decided to drop off these 2 hitchhikers to where he promised them. Now, thanks to these officers, Paul Knowles paused on his killings for some time to speak to his lawyer. He had known this lawyer in Florida called Sheldon Yavitt for some years now, so he decided to walk into his office and laid it flat to his lawyer. He simply said that he was a mass murderer, and Yavitt did not even flinch, and that's because he's used to defending the worst of the worst. So he advised Knowles that the best thing for him to do is to turn himself in. However, Knowles refused, as he didn't want to get him that easy. He wanted to be caught. He wanted to die in a noble way, and said he wasn't even done with his killings. He also said that he has recorded a series of what he has done. And so he made a deal with his lawyer Sheldon and instructed him to wait until his death before releasing these tapes to the public. So Sheldon had promised that he would definitely not be releasing these tapes until he knows that Knowles is dead. This was a promise he was not willing to break. Right after leaving his lawyer's office, Knowles drove off to Georgia, where he became friends with 45-year-old Caswell Carr. Reports suggest that it was more than friendship, where the two could have possibly had sexual intercourse. So one day, Carlson invited Knowles to stay over at his place, in which Knowles accepted. Whilst they were in the midst of their sexual activities, Knowles tied Caswell up with a curtain cord and goes to the kitchen. At this time, it is believed that Caswell was not worried about what Knowles was up to, but when Knowles returns, he is holding a pair of scissors and his demeanor had suddenly changed. He launched himself onto Caswell and stabbed him 27 times, to the extent whereby the scissors had actually broke. So you can imagine how many more times Caswell would have been stabbed if the scissors did not break. Now let's bear in mind that this is the first time we are seeing Knowles stab someone. And if you think about the fact that he stabbed Caswell 27 times, you can imagine the anger and emotions that went into this particular murder. And Paul Knowles just stood up and left the bedroom, off to find his next victim. And this victim happens to be in the same house as Caswell Carr. Caswell actually had a 15-year-old daughter named Amanda Carr, who at the time was in her room with the door closed. And Paul Knowles forcefully entered into her room, grabbed her, tied her up on her bed. He then proceeded to remove her stockings and shoved them so far down her throat, to the extent whereby medical examiners struggled to remove the stockings in the autopsy. And Knowles stood there and watched this 15-year-old girl suffocate on her own stockings. And then he proceeded to rape her. After all this, Knowles still ransacked the entire house, stealing things of value such as credit cards, money, clothes, ID, car, and many more. And after he had accomplished what he wanted, he got into the car and sped off into the night, making his way to Atlanta. There he booked himself into a Holiday Inn, got changed and got himself into one of Caswell's suits, and he made his way downstairs into the bar, where he met a beautiful red-haired lady, Sandy Fox, and she was immediately attracted to Paul Knowles. So Knowles approached Sandy using a fake name, Daryl Golden, and asked her to dance, but she turned him down, leaving Knowles to feel defeated. However, Knowles was determined to woo this woman over. Now Sandy was a journalist, and that night she actually had some work to do, so she told Knowles that she was working that night, and so she went off. However, when she came back to the pub that same night, Paul Knowles was there. He approached her and asked her to dance one more time, and this time she agreed. The two had dinner that night and they got to talking, where Knowles told Sandy that he was going to Miami that night, and Sandy said, "That's funny, I'm heading to Miami tomorrow," and so Knowles decided to drop her there. Sandy was reluctant but agreed on the condition that she was not going back to his hotel room that night. The reason behind her decision was simply because she didn't know this man, and she said for all she knows, he could have been another one of the Boston Strangler, which we all know Knowles was much worse than that. The two of them ended up sleeping in Sandy's hotel room that night, And in the morning, Sandy jokingly said, "Well, I guess you are not another Boston strangler. How disappointing." Little did she know he was worse. So the two of them ended up in Miami that day, and they spent the next few days going on dates. And on these dates, Knowles constantly said he didn't have long to live. He kept saying his lawyer had some information on him, and when he dies, the lawyer will release this information and it will make him famous. After a few weeks of them dating, Sandy broke things off simply because she wasn't feeling it anymore. But Knowles did not take this very well. He was actually very devastated and sad over this breakup, surprisingly. So he went to look for comfort in another woman, a woman Sandy had actually introduced to him named Susan Mackenzie. They were not too close, they only worked together. You know how Sandy was doing journalism, same way Susan Mackenzie was also doing journalism, going around to different states and building their portfolio. But both Susan and Knowles went out that night, and in the morning, Sandy received a call in her hotel room, and it was the police. They had asked her to come down to the station because something had happened and they needed to speak to her in person. So Sandy made her way to the police station, and when she gets there, it's worse than she could ever imagine. The detective sat her down and asked if she knew Susan Mackenzie, in which she responded saying yes, through journalism. And the detectives told her that Susan had almost been raped that night. Knowles had offered to drive Susan to her hair appointment on that day, and on their way, he pulled the car to one side and took out his gun, pointed it right in her face and told her to have sex with him. If not, he would shoot her. She somehow managed to escape from his car and run into the middle of the road. And Paul just put his foot on the gas and sped away. Susan managed to get a ride off someone and went straight to the police station. Now we have to remember that Knowles was going by a different name at this point. He was going by Darrell Gordon, and so the police couldn't find out who he was. However, one useful information Susan could provide was the car he was driving, and it didn't take long for the police to find him and pull him over. But Paul wasn't going to give himself up that easily. So once again, he pulled out his gun and started shooting at these officers. But the officers managed to run for cover and call for backup. However, by the time cover had arrived, it was already too late. Paul had sped off. By now, Paul knew there was an alert on that car, so he decided to ditch it and he fled on foot. So, this is now November 15th, and he decides to commit another home invasion. But this time, he didn't want to break in. He was going to trick his way in. So Knowles knocks on a door, and a woman named Beverly opens the door, and Paul starts lying. He said he was an IRS agent who needed to speak to her urgently, and Beverly let him in because obviously he is an IRS agent. Now Beverly actually used a wheelchair, so before she could even show him the sitting room, Knowles ambushed her, grabbed her out of the wheelchair, tied her up and threw her in her bedroom. And then he removed her stockings and gagged her up with it. Before long, Knowles had heard a commotion coming from the next room, so he decided to have a look. In there was Beverly's nephew. She was looking after him for her sister, who was going to be home any minute. So Knowles tied this young boy up and threw him in the same room with his auntie. All of a sudden, the front door opens. It was the young boy's mother, Barbara Tucker. When Barbara saw Knowles standing there, she began to ask him questions, like, who are you and what are you doing here? And Knowles calmly said the whole IRS agent lie again. But Barbara saying something weird about this situation. So she went up straight to the bedroom to look for her sister. And she saw her and her son tied up looking horrified. Barbara started to freak out and tell Knowles to untie them. But of course, Knowles wasn't going to do any of that. Instead, he grabbed Barbara, threw her in her car and drove off. Back at the house, Beverly had managed to wiggle her way out of the tie and untied herself and her nephew. She managed to get to the phone and called the police, where she explained the horrific situation. And the police were able to put an alert on Barbara's car. That same evening, the police had also found the red car in which Knowles had ditched earlier, and in there were other things he had ditched, including the will he drafted earlier with his lawyer, which had his full name right at the top. So now they knew exactly who they were looking for. So they took his picture, showed it to Beverly, and she said, "This is the name of the guy that had tied her up." In the red car, the police had also found Caswell car's clothes, and when they ran the license plate, they found that the car was reported stolen and belonged to the deceased Mr. Bates. Now the police had put 2 and 2 together now and knew that they were dealing with a very dangerous person and needed to get hold of him as soon as possible. Meanwhile, Knowles was driving Barbara to a motel during this time. Barbara was trying her absolute best to keep him distracted and engaged, so he asked her what she does for a living, and she said she is a writer. And Paul said once this is all over, he wanted Barbara to write a book about him. So they arrived at the motel and Knowles dragged her up and tied her to the bed. At this point, the police were onto him. They were putting 2 and 2 together, a bit of a pattern, and noticed that with most of the credit cards he had stolen, he often used them to get a motel. So by now, they knew that he was most likely on his way to a motel somewhere. So they sent police officers to every single motel. Back to the motel in which Knowles was staying, he had just put the TV on, and all he wanted was to see himself on the news, and that's exactly what he got. It seemed that that's all he wanted, the fame, the attention. Whilst they were watching the news, Barbara saw her own missing persons appeal, which said she was with a very dangerous man. She believed that she was going to get killed by this man, so she tried her absolute best to get him engaged and conversate with him and get him off the news. The 2 of them ended up sleeping at the motel that night. The next morning, Barbara was awoken by Knowles leaving the motel room. He said it was too risky and could feel that the police were getting closer. He told Barbara that he was going to leave her there, tied up, and that the police will find her soon. And with that, he got into Barbara's car and sped off. Within few hours, she was able to loosen the tie and run to safety, and she was able to go to the police station and report everything, including a crucial clue, which was that he was planning to go to Georgia that day, and they knew that they had to be ready between the borders of Florida and Georgia. That same morning, a highway patrol officer named Eugene Campbell saw the car Knowles was driving, flagged it down and pulled him over for an investigation. And when he did, Knowles pulled out a gun and aimed, and also managed to take Campbell's own gun. Now Campbell was defenseless and Knowles is pointing 2 guns at him. So he ordered him to get into his patrol car, handcuffed him so he can't move whilst Knowles drove the patrol car. But Paul knew he couldn't keep this car for too long, as it's possible that it could be tracked. So he decided to take the advantage of the police car by turning on the siren and just made the next car in front of him pull over. And when the car pulled over, Knowles got out with his gun and went over to the driver named James Mayer, ambushed him and took him as a hostage as well. Now let's bear in mind that this was all happening on a busy highway, so he was certainly seen by a lot of people, but nothing could be done, as by the time these witnesses called the police, it would have already been too late. The police did receive a lot of reports about this. However, like I said, it would have been too late by the time the police had arrived. The next morning, November 17th, Knowles was spotted and the police got on his case, where there was actually a high-speed police chase, and this chase was quite chaotic and fast that Knowles lost control of the car and ended up crashing it. And now he knew the police were going to catch up with him anytime now, so he abandoned the car and ran as fast as he could. Officers did try to shoot at him as he was running away, but he wasn't affected and got away from them. Now the police had run to his car and thought they were going to find the two hostages, but when they got there, the car was empty, and the police had hopes that they were safe, and the hunt for the killer continued. Now I want to emphasize that the police were putting all their efforts into catching this man. They had hundreds of police officers patrolling around, had helicopters circling around, loads of sniffer dogs, and officers back at the police station where new tips were coming every minute. So now Knowles is on foot running through the fields, and he managed to ditch the gun he had, which belonged to Officer Campbell, and he wanted to get hold of another one. And so he started looking for somewhere he could break into, and then he came across a farmhouse. He managed to find a gun and loads of ammo, and as he was leaving, he was actually caught by a random guy walking down the road. And as soon as Knowles saw this guy, he lifted up the gun and tried to shoot at him, but the gun jammed. He tried to shoot again, but the gun still jammed. So David noticed this and pulled out his own gun from the side of his pocket, and he pointed it at Knowles, and immediately Knowles fell into submission, and David grabbed hold of him, held him at gunpoint, and dragged him into the nearest house he could find so that they could call the police. So now, November 17th, 1974, Paul Knowles was finally arrested. The news of this spread so fast that by the time police had arrived and arrested him and took him back to the police station, the entire street of the police station was filled with hundreds of people. And you know Knowles, he was loving every second of this. This is what he has been looking forward to. The first thing the police did was put him into an interrogation room, and the first question they asked was where the two hostages were. Knowles responded by saying that he had killed them and did not provide any further information. But the very next day, their remains were found. A hunter walking through a wooded area found both of them deceased, handcuffed to the tree and shot. So now the police were trying to piece together all the crimes in which Paul Knowles was responsible for, but they could only piece together based on what they knew, and they couldn't figure out everything. So in this interrogation room, Paul Knowles was not budging at all. The main reason for this was the tapes. He didn't want it to come out before he had died. He told the police he had given it to his lawyer, a very serious tape that supposedly held his success, and Sheldon was going to release them when he was dead. These tapes became known as the kill tapes. So they got in touch with Sheldon, but he refused to hand them over and told the police that he made a promise to the client and he wasn't going to release the tape until Knowles was dead. Still till this day, Sheldon had not listened to the tapes. Now this of course goes against law. He can't keep a killer's confession tapes in his possession, especially when the police are asking for them. And so Sheldon was arrested, and he didn't care one bit. He cared more about keeping his word and his promise, because at the end of the day, it was going to make him look more credible to his future clients. Paul Knowles was in custody for weeks and weeks and weeks, but he was still not budging. He did not say a word. At this point, they finally got something out of him, and they asked him how many people he had killed. He used his hands to say 18, and a couple of days later, he changed it into 35, which of course creating confusion amongst the police and amongst his confessions. And the police knew that they needed to do something to get the lawyer to release those tapes. Then one of them suggested that they arrest Sheldon's wife for contempt of court. And as soon as they did, Sheldon said this has now gone too far and said in exchange for the tapes, they should release his wife. So now the police were in possession of those tapes. Unfortunately, we do not know the content of those tapes as it got damaged in a flood at the police basement. So the tapes don't exist anymore. But of course, before they were destroyed, the police did listen to them. However, it's reported that these tapes were still pretty vague, but everything I've said so far comes from the tape recordings. So you can judge from there. Remember Officer Campbell's gun that Knowles dumped in the middle of the bush on his run? Well, December 18th, Paul Knowles volunteered to go out with the police and get it. He was taken out and handcuffed before being placed in the back of the police vehicle. There was very little security in this vehicle, and at the front two seats were two officers, and one of them had seen Paul lit a cigarette, and he told Paul to extinguish it. However, Paul became very angry about this, and he decided to approach the police. Somehow, Paul Knowles had actually managed to remove his cuff using a paper clip that he had found somewhere, and so he was free all this while. So now he was fighting this officer for his gun, and the gun fired twice, and due to this they lost control of the car and it swerved and crashed. That was when the other officer pulled out his gun, turned to Paul and shot him 3 times, and there it was. Paul Knowles was done, dead and finished with his terror. The lawyer Sheldon had actually tried to argue for this deceased client, that his murder was unlawful because he couldn't possibly have been trying to run away because he was cuffed up. But of course, the court disagreed. So that concludes the murderous rampage of Paul John Knowles. I must admit that I am disappointed in the lawyer because he had every chance to save the lives of many people. However, he was solely concerned about keeping the promise he had made with his clients, just to show his loyalty to the other clientele. But let me know what you guys think about this. Do you think Sheldon had done the right thing? I personally don't think he did, because really and truly he could have saved, like I said, so many lives. Thank you all so much for joining me in today's video. Please do not forget to like, comment, share, and please do not forget to subscribe and turn on your post notifications so you will get notified each time I post. And I will see you guys in the next couple of days. Take care of yourselves. Bye.